Hello, my name is Ryan King, and I'm here today at the 2016 meetings of the American Society of Criminology, where I have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Joachim J. Savelsberg of the University of Minnesota. As a bit of background, Professor Savelsberg was born in 1951 in Werner, Germany, in the northwestern part of the country. He earned his diploma, which is the equivalent of an American master's degree, in sociology from the University of Cologne in 1978, and 4 years later, in 1982, received his doctorate from the University of Trier in the Federal Republic of Germany. As a young scholar, Professor Savelsberg held positions on each side of the Atlantic. He was a research fellow at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and later a John F. Kennedy Memorial Fellow at Harvard University. In Germany, he held positions as a research scientist at the University of Bremen and as Associate Director of the Criminological Research Institute of Lower Saxony. In 1989, he accepted a position as Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Minnesota, where he later was tenured and promoted to full Professor of Sociology and Law. He is a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology, a former editor of the Law and Society Review, and has many other scholarly honors and distinctions that are too numerous to mention here. Professor Savelsberg's research has at various junctures included the study of white-collar crime, the relevance of Weberian concepts for understanding criminal punishment and sentencing policy, collective memory and law, and more recently, human rights, specifically the representation of and responses to mass violence. His work appears multiple times in our leading journals, including the American Journal of Sociology and Criminology. And he has written several books in English and German, including Crime and Human Rights, American Memories, Atrocities in the Law, and Representing Mass Violence, Conflicting Responses to Human Rights Violations in Darfur. At the time of this interview, on November the 18th, 2016, Joachim resides in St. Paul, Minnesota with his wonderful wife, the respected anthropologist Pamela Feldman Savelsberg. He has two beautiful daughters, Anna and Rebecca, and two young grandchildren. Joachim, it's an honor for me to interview you here today for this oral history project.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for doing this.
My pleasure. I assume when you were educated in Germany that there were few criminology classes when you were a student. So was this in fact the case? And if so, how did you come to study law and crime?
It's a very good question. Your assumptions are right. I studied sociology as a major in my master's program, but it was an interdisciplinary program with a strong public policy component and economics component, and indeed I never took any criminology course. I never took any course in the sociology of law. I did take courses in urban sociology, and when we took urban sociology, we read a lot on community power studies, but we also read a lot of literature from the Chicago School of Sociology, where, of course, we encounter social problems. It's a major focus, and among them, we, of course, encounter literature on crime patterns. So this was certainly one very stimulating experience in my education. But you are right, I never took a criminology course or sociology of law course.
You mentioned the Chicago School as maybe a school of thought that had an influence. Were there particular people who you read on either side of the Atlantic that you found their work particularly appealing?
Well, there were voices on both sides of the Atlantic. In Germany, we had a relatively small group. It was called Working Group of Young Criminologists. But we read up on all the classic American literature. We, of course, read Sutherland, we read Merton, we read Jim Short, we read L. Cohen. And later I had the great pleasure and honor to meet Jim Short and Al Cohen, and we had wonderful conversations, and that certainly all contributed to stimulating my interest and shaping my interest in criminology, even though I never followed exactly their tracks of research, of course.
Was there, I'm just wondering, you mentioned American scholars. Were there European scholars at the time who were studying crime that had any influence on you, or was it pretty much all of your knowledge coming from this side of the pond?
It was mostly from this side of the pond, and this is true for sociology in Germany at the time in general. If you look at my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation, you would see that a good half of the literature that I process and cite is American literature. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that sociology or much of the social sciences were eliminated during the Nazi period, and several of my teachers had spent those years in exile in Australia, United States, and Switzerland, and had returned. to Germany to build up an empirical social science-oriented sociology, and I learned from them, and they inspired me, and they brought with them a lot of American literature. Some of them, the younger ones, didn't have opportunities in Germany right after the war. They went to America to earn their doctorates and then returned with those. And those were among my teachers and certainly had a major influence on me. Specifically, criminology was a latecomer in Germany, and there were not really very influential voices, except voices that translated American literature into German. And initially I read all the famous American sociologists in German translation.
You mentioned the Nazi past, a native of Germany. Your parents lived through this part of history. You were born shortly after World War II. Yes. You now study, among other things, human rights and atrocity. Right. Is it fair to draw a line between those two, or have parts of your biography led to your interest in these topics?
Oh, I have no doubt about that. It's one of those situations. C. Wright Mills, I think, once said, when history and biography meet, that's when sociological imagination gets sparked. And see, I was born you're right, in 1951, 6 years after the end of World War II in Germany, 6 years after the end of the Holocaust, in a small, relatively conservative German town. I grew up for 15 years of silencing the past, not the war, but the genocide. The history came into the open maybe in the mid-1960s, when a new generation of teachers had grown into the picture. And the conflicts between generations, which always exist, were of course colored by this experience, when we sometimes in a self-righteous manner reproached our parent generation for not having effectively stopped what we thought should have been stopped. And so this, of course, this historical experience was very prominent in my mind as I was a young, older adolescent, and then in my 20s and 30s. It was a bit like a cloud, a shadow over my existence. You cannot look at the world with a naive enjoyment if you are so mindful of this history, and if you struggle with the idea, well, how would you have acted if you had been born 20 years earlier or 25 years earlier, if you had been from the generation your parents were. My father was born in 1920. And it is a very strange thing that I moved into criminology and sociology of law, but never, and I applied it to white-collar crime, I applied it to sentencing guidelines, to sentencing disparities, but I never thought of connecting that, which was so prominent in my private mind, if you want, with my professional pursuits. And then history happened, of course. The 1980s and the Cold War came to an end, and genocide happened again in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And it became quite clear to me, and I'm not the only one, there are colleagues, I think of John Hagen, for example, who suddenly recognized, yes, what we are preoccupied with professionally is so closely linked to what we are interested in our private lives, or our lives as citizens, and so we should direct our criminological and sociology of law lens to those issues. And so for me, it began in the early 2000s that I started working on human rights crimes, war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and through a particular lens that maybe we can talk about in a moment.
Yeah, I imagine some of your studies have been on collective memory. I imagine that this would tie in with that as well.
Yes, indeed. The specific question that I pursued in my research, as you know, is how institutions color our perception of reality. And this also means our perception of the past, and this of course also means our perception of horrendous pasts. So when a war crime like My Lai in the Vietnam War, or the Holocaust, or the atrocities in Darfur get processed through judicial institutions, can they succeed in creating and strengthening a collective conscience that might have the capacity of preventing such events to occur in the future. In my writing, sometimes I cite famous statements by President Roosevelt and Justice Jackson from 1944, 1945, where they say something like, we need to document what has occurred with witnesses under oath and all the written documents so that posterity can never doubt the incredible things that were committed. So in a way, they wrote a history writing and collective memory forming function into the criminal law, at least into these types of trials against perpetrators of genocide. And it has been, for me, who grew up in silence about these issues, it was an important question. Can criminal law indeed achieve that? Can criminal law strengthen the collective conscience in a way that it might make it more difficult for future genocides to occur?
And briefly, maybe, can it?
I think the answer is yes and no. It can, because we see in our studies, and we have worked on this together for the My Lai case, that when we compare different narratives, in the My Lai case it was the narrative created in an administrative commission, the Pierce Commission, the narrative created in journalism by Seymour Hersh, the New York Times journalist who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about this event, but then also criminal trial. And we found that the criminal trial is reflected then in textbooks that are read by American high school students and also in journalistic reporting later, much more prominently than the journalistic account or the administrative commission account. So yes, I would conclude from, and also in my more recent research on Darfur, it is very recognizable that the crime and justice frame is reflected much more prominently in media reports than competing frames such as an armed conflict frame or a humanitarian emergency frame. Not in the beginning, but the more the judicial intervention advanced, the more this was the case. So that if you want, would make Roosevelt and Jackson happy. It would also support certain traditions in the sociology of law, like the Durkheimian tradition and today's neo-Durkheimians, who speak about trials as very potent rituals that have the potential of separating good from evil, of strengthening the collective conscience. Maybe also in line with scholars who focus on the particular legitimacy of legal proceedings based on the clear procedural rules. So that's the positive side. But there is a downside too, and the downside, of course, is that when you tell history through the lens of a criminal trial, it's a selective reading of history because there's a particular institutional logic at work in criminal proceedings. There is a focus on a few individual perpetrators. There's a limitation in terms of what evidence, empirical evidence, is admissible in court. There is a limitation because you can only distinguish the guilty from the not guilty. There's the big gray zone, especially in cases of genocide, the bystanders who did not intervene. All of this is left out of the story that is told in a criminal trial. So the history, the memory that's created there is a very selective memory.
This work on human rights and collective memory came later in your career, but early on you focused more on white-collar crime and sentencing, and you moved from Germany to the United States. What led you to the United States?
I moved to the United States for the first time in 1982. This was my first postdoctoral year, and I had a fellowship at the Johns Hopkins University. What interested me about America, of course, was the fact that growing up in Germany after World War II, I grew up in a world that was quite Americanized. So we listened to jazz music, we listened to Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and to Bob Dylan, who is now a Nobel laureate, which we didn't know back then. But also in academia, as I mentioned a moment ago, we were very much exposed to American scholarship, especially in a more empirically minded sociology. So clearly, for a young German who had gotten to this point in his career, this had to be of interest. But also more specifically in my dissertation, I worked on delinquency and the criminalization of young immigrants to Germany. And obviously, this is a story where America had so much more experience than Germany. And so I was very motivated to come to the US and study minority crime, minority delinquency, but also with a particular eye on programs to prevent that form of crime and delinquency. And this actually became a key experience, I think a key moment in my professional career. Sometimes there's something that happens and that colors the way we see the world for years to come, that I would be happy to talk more about.
Yeah, before we get to that though, would you say there's a more, I would assume there's a more developed field of criminology in Europe today than when you were a student?
Yes.
Are there differences today in terms of the European or Germany specifically in the way that crime is studied in comparison to the US?
Well, you are right that today the field of criminology is more developed in Europe. There's now a European Journal of Criminology, for example, but it is by far not as developed as it is in the United States. So there were, when I came to America, and this, first it was one postdoc here, and then I got sucked in because I met wonderful people here, and I mentioned a few names a moment ago, Al Cohn and Jim Short, but also Ralph Taylor, who is now at Temple, Bob Kidder, and some sociologists like Ed Lauman at Chicago and Herb Gans at Columbia. And I had very inspiring conversations, but there were two things about American academia that I appreciated particularly. One thing is that universities are much less hierarchically organized than German universities, where you have a few shareholders and then many assistants who teach the required courses underneath them. And this is a more democratic model in America, and I appreciated that. And the other factor was that America is a large country and sociology was more developed and established in this country. So when you work in a specialty area like criminology, and you come from Germany where you might have groups of 30 people working on this, and you come here and you have, well, maybe back then it was the crim section in the ASA initially that I attended, you have 600 or 700. Or in sociology of law, maybe you had 20, 25 people in Germany. You come here, and where we created the sociology of law section, but we had immediately 400 members. So you have a critical mass. And I think that's very important because within a critical mass, you have a number of competing paradigms. And you don't have just one or two leading scholars who kind of dictate what direction the train is supposed to take. So those were things I found very attractive about American academia, and they certainly, in addition to meeting my American wife, when I was during my first postdoc here at Johns Hopkins, she was a graduate student at the time, and we played together in the Johns Hopkins University Orchestra. So those were things, professional and private, that encouraged me to maybe one day move to America for good.
Which you did,
Yes.
and maybe not for good. Maybe you'll retire back in Europe, but you've been here for some time. As an immigrant to the country, as somebody schooled in Germany, moving to the United States, I can imagine this could cut one of two ways in terms of your scholarship, and it could be an advantage for you. Sometimes it's helpful to look from the outside in. On the other hand, perhaps it could pose difficulties for you. Maybe it's harder to become established when you're an outsider. One or the other of those ring true, or perhaps both?
Both ring true, of course. Yes, it does make a difference when you come to a country and you don't have an advisor in that country, you don't have a cohort of fellow students. You have to work really hard, you have to go to meetings, you have to reach out to people, you have to build a network, and yet the network you build is a very ego-centered network. You have connections to A, to B, to C, and to D, and you're not part of a web of affiliation. So it's a more challenging situation, I would certainly say. At the same time, it's a very productive experience because whenever we live between social worlds as social scientists, we are in a position where we cannot take things for granted. We always have to question the social construction of reality, or we are mindful of the fact that the social reality is constructed. We cannot live as easily with matter of course assumptions as maybe other people do. And I think that's the productive side. We also experience maybe culture shock, surprises at moments, and there, maybe I will mention this here, it was a very specific moment when I came to study community-based crime prevention, and I had read the American literature, but what I read in Germany came with a time lag. So I read about the mobilization for youth program, for example, and this was an orientation in community-based crime prevention that I would say was based on Miltonian ideas to supply underprivileged people with legitimate opportunities in order to prevent crime and delinquency. And we find such arguments even reflected in presidential addresses by conservative presidents like Eisenhower at that time. When I came in the early 1980s, and I talked to people in the city administration in Baltimore, to social workers, people at the National Institute of Justice, to some criminal justice scholars, I initially had a hard time communicating, and the reason was that the meaning of community-based crime prevention had changed so radically, and people had forgotten about the old meaning. It now meant community police collaboration to report suspicious behavior, so it was more control orientation than a providing legitimate opportunities orientation. And that struck me, and that made me think about what it is about America that allows for such dynamic in knowledge production, in the development of ideas. It's something that became quite important to me later when I looked at the very different dynamics of criminal punishment in Europe versus the United States.
Mm-hmm. That's a great moment to transition maybe a little bit from your biography to your scholarship. You've had a number of distinctions: editor of Law and Society Review, fellow of American Society of Criminology. I believe there was an award from a theory section, perhaps from the SSSP. When you reach the end of your career, hopefully 2 decades from now, what themes or ideas do you hope that people associate with your name?
Well, there are some things that I've tried to do, and if they were remembered by future young scholars, that would please me. And I think one idea that I try to pursue is that we have such great potential in our classic theorists. You would normally not bring Max Weber's sociology of law together with the idea of sentencing guidelines, but that's exactly what I did when I was on my second fellowship at Harvard and studied the making of the US sentencing guidelines. I applied Weberian ideas of formal rationalization, which seems to be very much in line with the model of sentencing guidelines, a formal and rational model of meting out sentences. But I also saw in Weber very sensitive historical comparative notions about certain societal groups and structural elements that would impede this move toward formal rationality, like legal clients who want reasonable outcomes, social justice advocates who don't just want an automaton at work, the judicial or legal profession that is interested in maintaining some degree of discretion. It's an important attribute of a status group. So this connection between classical literature and contemporary issues, even policy instruments or criminal justice instruments like sentencing guidelines, I think we can get a lot of mileage out of that. The other part, of course, is that I try to impress on those who read my work a comparative perspective. Not take for granted what occurs in one country, and we see that very different mechanisms may be at work in other countries, and that we need to be sensitive to the nation-specific conditions of social reality, including that of crime and law, of course.
Thank you. And looking back at this point in time, is there a particular project that sticks out to you as having been particularly rewarding, or one that you say to yourself, I'm really glad that I invested in that one?
Well, I think I'm pleased with my work on sentencing guidelines. Maybe more important to me is my work on comparative rates of punishment, because that's where I bring my experience and exposure to European versus American institutions to bear. So that's really that carries my signature, maybe even more. And then my most recent line of work on human rights crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. If there's anything I regret, maybe it is that I got to these topics relatively late in my career. They really motivate me. They really they're themes I cannot let go of, and so I'm very, very pleased about my work on comparative punishment, and even more about having eventually gotten to the topic of human rights crimes.
I know as your student that you were a great teacher who had a very profound effect on my own career, and I have my thoughts as to what made you a great mentor. From your perspective, how would you characterize the way you go about mentoring students? How have you been so successful with that?
Well, I don't know. In your case, I know that you are a wonderful scholar, and if I made a small contribution to that, then to know that would please me greatly. There are others. Holly Naisef-Brehm, who is now on your faculty too, is a wonderful scholar. Wenji Liao, who is now at North Carolina State, is a great scholar. Yuzhu Qian, she went back home to Taiwan, teaches at the National University of Taiwan in Taipei. And there are others. I don't know, I think I take people seriously, and I take them seriously when they succeed, and I take them seriously when they go through rough stretches and get frustrated and don't proceed. This is true in my undergraduate teaching too. If somebody comes to me with serious questions, but who has a C average, I take that person seriously and devote myself to that person. That's one thing. Another thing is that I think I keep students from getting carried away in too many directions. I try to impress on them, and you know this, that yes, some diversity is important, but the focus is important too. And number three, I am an advisor who does not appreciate having a super homogeneous committee. I appreciate it when my advisees go to other faculty who have skills that I do not have, and gather those skills there. And, you know this very well, because you are a very sophisticated quantitative sociologist now, in addition to other things. You didn't learn that part from me. So I think being exposed to very different intellectual traditions, very different methodological traditions, for an advisee is an extremely valuable experience, and I try to foster that, or at least allow for it.
In your own work that you hope your advisees carry on, or do you see them carrying it on?
Well, I certainly would hope that what is important to me, a comparative perspective, would be carried on, that people continue to take theoretical ideas seriously, even when they engage in empirical work, no matter the type of work, ethnography or statistical work. There are certain themes, of course, that are close to my heart, such as collective representations and memory, the logic of criminal courts, the conditions of punishment, the institutions, the shape that institutions take that mete out punishment. And if my former advisees were to pay attention to some of these themes, that would please me. I'd
like to turn maybe to get your thoughts on the field of criminology more generally. more than any scholar that I've ever worked with, you often step back and even in your written work have done a sociology of criminology, and I had the privilege of working with you on some of that. The field today, I guess first, throughout your career, would you say that the field has changed much? And if so, what sticks out to you as maybe one or two of the most notable?
Yes, yes. Oh, the field has changed very much. And how do I think about the field? What would I hope for? Well, I would hope, for example, that more criminologists deal with the kinds of themes that I've turned to in recent years, because I once tried to, from Archer and Gardner, to extrapolate the number of people killed in homicides during the 20th century, and I arrived at a sort of rough estimate, 20 million people. When we look at the number of people killed in genocides and war crimes and crimes against humanity, we arrive at 180 to 200 million people. It's a tenfold death toll, and this does not include war deaths. So I would hope that criminology in the future will invest more effort in this substantive line. The field itself, and you know this as well as I do, used to be at home when I arrived in America, or before, in the 60s and 50s, certainly in sociology departments. And since then it has differentiated itself into its own field with its own institutions, departments, colleges, journals. And initially this was an effort to create a multidisciplinary field. And this is something I'm very much in favor of. I've co-authored with lawyers, I've co-authored with psychologists. But as it became more established, I am concerned that it will no longer be a multidisciplinary field, but that it will create its own intellectual and institutional niche within academia, separated from the mother disciplines. And so you just have another specialization in our already specialized world. That's something I'm concerned about. Another thing I'm concerned about is that in part, at least, not throughout, but in part, this specialization occurs in the neighborhood of state administration, the criminal justice system. And I'm all in favor that we do work that will generate a more humane and a more effective type of law enforcement. I'm very much behind that effort, but we must not allow the administrative field to dictate the terms, the questions, the kinds of data we work with. And the closer the criminology field moves toward the administrative sector, toward the world of criminal justice, the more I think we are at risk that might happen. So that's where I have a big concern, and I'm sure there are very different philosophies and justifications. My personal preference continues to be that we teach criminology in the context of sociology departments, because there students get exposed to ideas from political sociology, from cultural sociology, from urban sociology, and all of that I think is crucial to make sense of crime, to make sense of reactions to crime.
But would those students not lose some perspective that might come from psychology and from other disciplines? How would you respond? I think, if I remember correctly, John Laub gave an address once in which he very respectfully, but perhaps disagreed a little bit. Do you recall that Sutherland address?
Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts were on the counterpoint.
Well, as I said, I'm very much in favor of cross-disciplinary collaboration, and I think our students, and we have this built into our programs, right? Our dissertation committees are expected to have one member who is not part of the discipline, who is a psychologist, for example. Maybe that is not enough. Maybe we can achieve some of this by having students read literature from other disciplines. But I'm wondering, and maybe the evidence isn't really out yet, I'm wondering if by creating this niche of criminology within academia, we generate an academic field that no longer is indeed interdisciplinary, but that is just a new specialized niche. And then I wonder what the soul of that niche is. And what I see many times, not everywhere of course, but many times, that the soul seems to be a reflection of what happens in the criminal justice world.
Mm-hmm. On that note, you'd mentioned you see some potential danger, at least caution, in the pull of that policy audience and the role of the state there. You've been in this discipline for quite some time. Was there a time when this changed? If you look back, would you say, well, here's where we were on the right track, and then this is where we started to get too close to the policy audience?
There was a very specific moment, indeed. This was the time of the LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Agency, in the early 1970s. There was a very honorable effort, of course, to professionalize law enforcement and criminal justice professionals, and I appreciated that. At the same time, when this demand for academic training for criminal justice professionals unfolded and was funded by the LEAA, a lot of money was poured into those programs. And universities, and this is the character of American universities, that depend so much on tuition funding rather than being fully covered by tax dollars, like it would be the case in most European universities, jumped at the opportunity and created these new fields. And so I think it was the 1970s, by the mid-1980s, you had more criminology and criminal justice students than sociology students in the country. First at the undergraduate level, but then, of course, there was demand for scholarship. There was an effort to self-recruit, and so there was an incentive to also create graduate programs and in criminology and criminal justice. So I think that the 1970s and 80s were really the turning point. Ron Akers wrote I think it was his presidential address to the Southern Sociological Association, very interesting essay about that. Yeah, I think that's an important stage. It's the formation. We see the growth of the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in the 80s, in the 90s, and it is a very different operation today from what it was 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. You have a reputation as a skilled theorist. Is there a correlation between this pull of the policy audience and the focus on justice institutions? Would you say that have we lost something in terms of a focus on theory? Has our scholarship become too policy oriented?
I would be very hesitant to generalize. Mm-hmm. There are some sectors in criminology where that certainly is the case, but I can also list a number of colleagues who continue to be very engaged with theory, and it is a diverse field. It is not uniform because it is still practiced also in different disciplines, but also within criminology, criminal justice program, there is quite a diversity of scholars, many of whom I admire greatly, and I also still see theoretical engagement there. But I see this more as a risk, as something that I see somewhat reflected in current work and that might intensify in the future, and that's something I'm concerned about.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned earlier one thing that maybe is underappreciated, or if not neglected, and until recently has been the focus on human rights, on mm-hmm. the number of deaths that occur by genocide yes. and war crimes. Are there any others, thinking about the field more generally, are there other issues that you would hope that maybe your students or the next generation of criminologists will give more attention to, or is that the one that you would say we really need to learn more about?
Well, there's a lot of attention paid to things that attention should be paid to. I think of fantastic scholarship on inner city poverty and concentrated poverty and racial segregation and crime, and I think that is just so essential, especially in the American context, but not just in the American context. And this research is happening, and I hope it will continue to happen. I think we must, and the Punishment in Society movement does that, pay a lot of attention to this. massive expansion of punishment, criminal punishment, that has occurred in the United States, where now we have an imprisonment rate that is 5 times as high as it was in the early 1970s. And probation, by the way, has increased similarly. It's not that one took the place of the other. Imprisonment rate that is 5 times as high as in the average European country. And I think we need to pay great attention. We also need to pay attention to certain practices, like the isolation of prison inmates. I think of the famous essay by Hughes on Good People and Dirty Work, which he wrote when he visited Germany as part of the denazification programs after World War II. And he said, it's a risk in modern society. We, as citizens, issue our concerned statements, maybe punitive demands, and then we leave the execution to the professionals. And we don't look anymore what happens behind prison walls. And I think we should. And if citizens don't and can't, then we as scholars have to do that.
So I've done my best in this interview to ask about your work, your background, but I'm sure there's a chance I left something out. As we conclude this interview, is there anything that you'd like to add that we didn't cover here?
Well, Ryan, I'd like to add my expression of great admiration for you.
Thank you.
And this interview is just a reflection of who you are and how you work, and you work very thoroughly and deliberately, and that was reflected in the questions you asked me. And I think they allowed me to give answers which hopefully give those who read my work maybe some additional insight into me, my life, my career, and I thank you very much for that.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Joachim.
Thank you, Ryan.
Okay.